The second week of October 2011 in Lexington, Georgia, hung suspended in that strange, static transition between the smothering heat of a deep southern summer and the sharp, wood-smoke-scented arrival of autumn. Inside the Oglethorpe County Agricultural Extension Office, the air conditioner rattled a steady, metallic rhythm against the window glass. Silas Vance pushed through the heavy glass door and stepped onto the scuffed linoleum, carrying a white 5-gallon bucket that had once held drywall mud. Silas was 36 years old, a man built out of sharp angles and quiet, deliberate movements. He had the kind of deep-creased, sun-cured skin that usually belonged to much older men, and hands permanently shadowed with the ghost of diesel grease from his former life as a heavy machinery mechanic. He didn't look like a farmer, at least not the kind of farmer that usually frequented the extension office. He lacked the branded seed company cap and the easy, booming conversational cadence of men who measured their lives in hundreds of acres of soybeans. He walked up to the front counter, his work boots squeaking faintly on the floor, and set the heavy bucket down with a dull thud. Inside that bucket rested roughly 40 small, lopsided apples. To call them apples felt like a generous stretch of the botanical imagination. They were the color of bruised bronze, coated in a thick, rough russeting that felt like fine sandpaper against the thumb. They were heavily scarred with dark, star-shaped scabs, asymmetrical, and altogether no larger than golf balls. They possessed a dense, unforgiving weight. If you dumped them on a table, they looked less like fruit meant for human consumption and more like medieval ammunition, the kind of crude projectiles you might load into a leather sling to deter a trespasser. Warren Cleary heard the thud and emerged from his back office, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Warren was a county institution. He wore a crisp khaki shirt with the University Extension logo stitched over the breast pocket, and he had spent the last 22 years advising local landowners on exactly how much nitrogen to apply to their pecan orchards, how to thin their loblolly pine stands, and how to eradicate invasive weeds. He was a man of science, yield charts, and predictable, profitable outcomes. "Help you?" Warren asked, leaning over the counter to peer into the bucket. "Hoping you might be able to tell me what I've got here," Silas said, his voice a low, steady gravel. "Just bought a foreclosed property out on the Maxey's Highway. There's about 14 acres of scrub in the back. Found a whole thicket of these growing wild." Warren peered deeper into the bucket, his brow furrowing. It is worth noting here that in the world of commercial agriculture, beauty and uniformity are next to godliness. A good apple is large, glossy, perfectly round, and sweet enough to satisfy a child's palate. What Warren was looking at was an affront to a century of selective breeding. He reached in and picked one up. It felt like a stone in his palm. He rubbed the dull, bronze skin against his khaki shirt, an instinctive gesture that did absolutely nothing to shine the rough russeting, and then he took a bite. It took less than 3 seconds for the physical reaction to hit. Warren's eyes watered instantly, his jaw locked, his lips puckering as if he had just chewed on an alum block. His face contracted into a mask of pure, involuntary revulsion. He turned with surprising speed, leaned over the counter, and spat the fibrous pulp directly into the aluminum trash can beside his desk. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his tongue working desperately to scrape the coating from the roof of his mouth. "Son," Warren finally croaked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and dropping the rest of the half-bitten apple into the trash. "I don't know what you paid for that foreclosed property out on the Maxey's Highway, but whatever it was, you overpaid." Silas stood perfectly still, his expression unchanging. "Is that right?" "Those are spitters," Warren said, reaching for a foam cup of water on his desk and taking a frantic swig. "Feral seedlings, total genetic junk. A bird ate an apple core 50 years ago, dropped a seed in the dirt, and let nature take its cruel course. They've got the sugar content of a raw potato and the bitterness of a wet tea bag. They're useless. You can't eat 'em, you can't bake 'em, and you sure as hell can't sell 'em." Warren leaned heavily on the counter, looking at Silas with a mixture of pity and professional exasperation. "You need to hire a D7 bulldozer. Go in there, clear that whole 14 acres of scrub, Rip out the root balls, burn the slash, and plant coastal Bermuda grass. Run some cattle on it, or cut it for hay. That's the only way you'll see a dime of return. I can give you a guy's number who runs a dozer for 110 an hour. He does good, clean work. Silas looked at Warren. He looked down at the bucket of ugly, lopsided fruit. He didn't argue with the older man. He didn't get angry, and he didn't try to defend the chaotic, overgrown patch of earth he had just poured his entire life savings into. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Cleary," Silas said softly. He reached out, grabbed the wire handle of the bucket, and lifted it off the linoleum. He nodded politely to the extension agent, turned his back, and walked out into the crisp, sunlit October afternoon. He loaded the bucket into the passenger seat of his 2003 Dodge Ram 2500, looping the seatbelt through the handle so it wouldn't tip over. As he turned the key and the heavy diesel engine rumbled to life, he looked over at the bruised, bronze spheres. He wasn't going to call the bulldozer operator. He knew exactly what a D7 cost to run, having repaired their hydraulic lines for the better part of a decade. But more importantly, Silas knew something Warren Cleary didn't. Warren had tasted the paralyzing tannins and the sharp, battery acid bite of the fruit, and registered it only as a failure. He had judged it by the standards of a grocery store shelf. But Silas wasn't looking to bake a pie. He was looking at the chemical makeup of survival. He knew that the very tannins that had just turned the extension agent's mouth inside out were the exact, highly coveted compounds required to ferment a traditional, old-world hard cider of staggering complexity. Warren saw useless scrub. Silas Vance saw liquid gold. Putting the truck in gear, he merged onto the highway, heading home. To make sense of why a man would blatantly ignore the advice of a 22-year agricultural veteran and willingly harbor 14 acres of botanical garbage, you have to understand the underlying architecture of his brain. Silas Vance, at 36 years old, was not a son of the soil. He had no romantic illusions about the nobility of working the land. For the vast majority of his adult life, he had been a heavy diesel mechanic working out of the massive John Deere implement dealership on the outskirts of Athens. His specialty wasn't simple engine blocks. He was the man they called for catastrophic hydraulic failures on $500,000 combine harvesters. When you spend thousands of hours diagnosing why a maze of pressurized hoses and valves has suddenly failed, you develop a very specific, stubborn worldview. Silas believed, fundamentally, that nothing existed without a function. If a complex system wasn't working, the answer wasn't to take a cutting torch to it and send the slag to the scrapyard. The answer was to wipe away the grease, find the original factory schematics, and figure out exactly what it had been engineered to do before the neglect set in. That mechanical pragmatism is precisely what led him to the foreclosed property out on the Maxey's Highway. Over his years turning wrenches, living frugally, and driving a truck with 200,000 miles on the odometer, he and his wife Clara had managed to scrape together $41,500. Clara was a pediatric nurse at Piedmont Athens Regional Hospital. She worked grueling 12-hour shifts, often coming home long after dark, her scrubs smelling faintly of industrial sanitizer, her feet aching from the hard hospital wards. They were both tired of the relentless, grinding pace of town living, and they had used $28,000 of their hard-won savings as a down payment on a 38-acre farm that had been sitting paralyzed in probate court for 9 years. The math of the place was what had drawn him in. 24 of those acres were gentle, rolling pasture, decent enough for a few head of cattle or leased hay operation, but the remaining 14 acres were a genuine nightmare. They were situated on a steep south-facing slope, and they consisted of a tangled, briar-choked, utterly impenetrable mess of feral apple trees. The farm's previous owner, a notoriously solitary man named Arthur Pritchard, had passed away in 2002. Without his constant intervention, the Georgia wilderness had immediately moved in to reclaim the hillside. Poison ivy climbed the trunks like thick, hairy ropes, and the canopy was a chaotic, unpruned riot of dead wood and water sprouts. When the regional bank had sent an appraiser out to assess the property for the foreclosure sale, the man had taken one look at that hillside and appraised it as dead land. He had assigned the 14-acre orchard a value of exactly $0, operating on the standard assumption that any prospective buyer would have to pay tens of thousands of dollars just to bulldoze the mess into burn piles. Because of that $0 valuation, Silas had managed to secure the entire property for $142,000, a steal even in the depressed market of 2011. Warren Cleary, the extension agent, had seen a mess that needed clearing. The bank appraiser had seen a financial liability. But Silas didn't look at the overgrown slope and see a ruined farm. He looked at it the exact same way he looked at a seized hydrostatic transmission. He saw an asset that had simply been disconnected from its power source for a decade. He just had to figure out what those ugly, bitter little apples were built to do. The world Silas and Clara had bought into wasn't a place of whimsical agricultural experimentation. Rural Oglethorpe County in the early 2010s ran on a very specific, unforgiving economic arithmetic. You didn't gamble on dirt out here. You played the established odds. You grew broiler chickens in 500-foot-long corrugated metal houses that hummed with giant exhaust fans 24 hours a day, filling the humid air with the sharp ammonia scent of poultry litter. You managed loblolly pine timber on slow, generational 30-year cycles. Or you meticulously sprayed and pruned pecan groves, waiting out the relentless boom and bust of the global nut markets. If a man absolutely insisted on growing fruit in this heavy red clay stretch of the Georgia Piedmont, he grew peaches. That was the unwritten law of the land. Apples? Apples were something people cultivated 3 hours north, up where the air finally cooled and thinned out in the Appalachian foothills of Ellijay. And even then, they grew massive, sweet, crimson-skinned dessert apples, Galas, Fujis, Honeycrisps, the kind of fruit genetically selected to survive a bruising truck ride and sit in a plastic bag under supermarket fluorescents for $1.49 a pound. Arthur Pritchard had most certainly not planted Honeycrisp. You have to look through the eyes of a traditional farmer to grasp just how offensive this hillside appeared. To a local grower, land is a ledger, and an overgrown field is a flashing red deficit. The 14-acre orchard Silas had inherited was a botanical riot, a suffocating jungle of thorny blackberry briars and poison ivy vines as thick as a mechanic's wrist. The vines climbed the trunks, choking out the sun and dragging the lower branches to the earth. The canopy was a wild, unpruned nightmare of dead wood and desperate water sprouts, reaching for whatever light they could steal. When Silas had first waded into the thicket, swinging a machete with his heavy leather gloves, he had found the hidden bones of Pritchard's vision. The trees were grafted onto M111 semi-dwarf rootstock, planted in geometrically perfect, albeit now invisible, rows back in 1978. That made them 33 years old. They were gnarly, thick-trunked things, coated in a pale green armor of lichen. They looked ancient, battered, and entirely out of place. The local consensus around the gas station in Maxey's was that Arthur Pritchard had been eccentric at best and completely touched at worst, ultimately wasting 14 acres of prime, south-facing pasture on a doomed, stubborn experiment. Silas was reminded of this consensus on his third day living on the property. He was out near the eastern property line, using a pair of heavy loppers to free a rusted barbed wire fence from a curtain of wild muscadine vines, when a side-by-side ATV rolled up on the other side of the wire. The driver was Harlan Royce, a commercial poultry grower whose 6 massive broiler houses dominated the adjacent ridge. Harlan was a large, ruddy-faced man who smelled permanently of diesel exhaust and damp pine shavings. He cut the ATV's engine, crossed his thick forearms over the steering wheel, and watched Silas wrestle with the vines. Harlan wasn't arrogant like the extension agent in Lexington. He was simply a man who possessed a deep, cellular hatred of inefficiency. "You the mechanic from Athens?" Harlan said. It wasn't a question. News traveled faster than a grass fire out here. Silas wiped a streak of sweat and clay from his forehead with the back of his canvas glove. "Silas Vance. Good to meet you." "Harlan Royce. Figure we're neighbors now." Harlan nodded toward the impenetrable wall of the orchard looming behind Silas. The late afternoon shadows were already getting trapped in its tangled depths. "I knew old Arthur. Kept to himself. Read a lot of books he bought through the mail. But I'll tell you right now, That hillside over there drove him to an early grave. Harlan leaned closer, his tone shifting to one of genuine, neighborly pragmatism. Listen, Vance, I know what it's like trying to get a place shaped up when it's been let go. It's a heavy psychological weight. You look at that mess every morning and it drains the ambition right out of your boots. Tell you what, next week, between flocks, I've got a couple days downtime. I'll pull my John Deere over here with the 15-foot bush hog rotary cutter on the back. Won't charge you a dime for the fuel or the time. We can knock that whole damn eyesore flat in an afternoon. Rip it right down to the topsoil, just so you don't have to look at it anymore, and I don't have to worry about the copperheads breeding in there wandering over to my sheds. Silas looked over his shoulder at the gnarled, lichen-covered trunks of the 33-year-old trees. He saw the structure hidden beneath the chaos. He saw the deep, established root systems clinging to the clay, holding the slope together. I appreciate the offer, Harlan. I really do, Silas said, turning back to the fence and gripping his loppers. But I think I'm going to leave them in the ground a while longer. Harlan stared at him for a long, quiet moment. He didn't argue. He slowly reached down and turned the key on the ATV, the engine roaring back to life. "Suit yourself, neighbor," Harlan shouted over the mechanical noise, shaking his head. "But you can't fix a machine if the engine block's made of mud." He threw the vehicle into gear and drove off, leaving Silas alone in the humid quiet with his rusted fence and his acres of beautiful, misunderstood ruin. The revelation didn't hit Silas out among the briars and the poison ivy. It arrived 2 weeks later in the suffocating, wasp-filled stillness of the farmhouse attic. Silas had spent a humid Tuesday afternoon hauling boxes of Arthur Pritchard's Abandoned Life toward the stairs. The air up under the roof was thick with the smell of dry rot, baked dust, and the lingering metallic scent of old insulation. Amidst a stack of mildewed magazines and rusted coffee tins filled with assorted bolts, Silas found a ledger. It was bound in cracked red vinyl, the color of dried Georgia clay, its spine barely held together by a brittle strip of electrical tape. Silas wiped a smear of grit from the cover with his thumb and flipped it open. It wasn't a diary. It was a manual. It was Pritchard's planting log, the meticulous, handwritten record of a man who possessed a singular, obsessive vision. Silas turned the yellowed pages until he reached a spread dated March 14th, 1978. The columns were drawn with a straight edge, the ink faded to a pale sepia. Pritchard hadn't just thrown random seedlings into the dirt, and he hadn't trusted the birds. He had sourced specific scion wood and grafted them by hand onto his rootstocks. Silas traced his grease-stained index finger down the list of varieties, mouthing the words to the empty attic. They didn't sound like anything you'd find shrink-wrapped on a styrofoam tray at the local grocery store. They sounded like the names of 19th century bare-knuckle boxers or wasp Appalachian haulers. Hughes Virginia crab, Harrison, Taliaferro, Campfield, Black twig. Silas closed the ledger. He carried it downstairs like it was a fragile glass pane, set it on the laminate kitchen table, and opened his laptop. He typed the first name into the search bar, then the second, then the third. As the search results populated the screen, the mechanical, diagnostic part of Silas's brain locked in. The disparate, nonsensical pieces of the last 2 weeks suddenly snapped together with the satisfying, heavy click of a well-machined gear slipping into place. These were not eating apples. They were never meant to be baked into a pie or packed into a child's lunchbox. They were vintage American cider apples, a collection of practically extinct commercial varieties, cultivated back in the 18th and 19th centuries for one strict, uncompromising purpose: the production of hard cider. Here's where a little agricultural chemistry is required, because the chemistry is the entire foundation of Silas Vance's gamble. If you take a modern grocery store Honeycrisp and press it into juice for fermentation, you are essentially fermenting sugar water. The resulting alcohol is thin, flabby, and completely devoid of character. But a Hughes Virginia crab is a different piece of machinery entirely. A standard dessert apple might hit a Brix level, the measurement of sugar content, of 12. A Hughes crab clocks in at a massive 18. Yet it doesn't taste sweet when you bite into it. Why? because it is loaded with dense, biting malic acid and overwhelming concentrations of polyphenols, better known as tannins. Tannins are the astringent compounds that strip the moisture from your tongue and make your mouth violently pucker. They are the exact reason Warren Cleary had gagged and spat a mouthful of Arthur Pritchard's legacy into a metal trash can. But when you introduce yeast to that juice, a violent alchemy takes place. In the crucible of fermentation, those harsh tannins break down to provide the deep, leathery mouthfeel, the structural backbone, and the complex, soaring flavor profiles of a premium vintage wine. Without tannins, cider is just spiked apple juice. With them, it is a sophisticated, sought-after craft beverage. Silas kept scrolling, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in his eyes. In the fall of 2011, the American craft cider movement wasn't just growing, it was exploding. Breweries and boutique cider houses were springing up from Asheville to Portland, all desperately trying to replicate the dry, complex ciders of England and France. And they had hit a massive supply chain wall. There was virtually no true cider fruit left in the United States. Prohibition had seen to that, driving farmers to chop down their bitter cider orchards and plant sweet eating apples instead. Cider makers were begging for high tannin fruit. They were fighting over scraps. The forums and agricultural message boards Silas read were full of frantic buyers offering up to $2.20 a pound for true cider apples. Silas opened a second tab and checked the current wholesale price for conventional dessert apples. They were trading at 28 cents a pound. He leaned back in his kitchen chair, the cracked red ledger sitting next to his keyboard. He looked out the window toward the hillside, now completely swallowed by the dark. The bank appraiser had valued it at $0. The extension agent had told him to bulldoze it. His neighbor wanted to chop it into mulch. But out there in the dark, suffocating beneath decades of poison ivy and wild brambles, Silas Vance was sitting on 14 acres of an absolute monopoly. November nights in Oglethorpe County have a way of seeping up through the floorboards of old pier and beam farmhouses, bringing a damp, creeping chill that settles right into your joints. Clara Vance pushed through the back door at 8:15 on a Wednesday evening, bringing a gust of that cold air into the kitchen with her. Her rubber-soled nursing clogs hit the scuffed linoleum with the heavy, definitive thud of a woman who had just spent 12 consecutive hours on her feet in a pediatric ward. She smelled faintly of institutional hand sanitizer, stale coffee, and exhaustion. She dropped her canvas tote bag onto a wooden chair, walked to the sink, and began washing her hands with hot water, staring blankly out the window into the pitch-black yard. Only when she turned around, drying her hands on a dish towel, did she process the strange tableau waiting for her. Silas was sitting at the laminate kitchen table. He hadn't touched his dinner. Instead, he had cleared the surface entirely to make room for his artifacts. In the center sat his heavy Panasonic laptop, its screen glowing a bright, sterile white. To its left was a weathered ledger bound in cracked red vinyl. To its right was a yellow legal pad, completely covered in Silas's tight, blocky, all-caps handwriting. Silas was practically vibrating with a suppressed electric energy. Clara knew that look. It was the exact same intensely focused, borderline obsessive stare he got whenever he was staring down a completely shattered planetary gear assembly on a 1998 Peterbilt tractor, right before he figured out exactly how to rebuild it from scratch. "Sit down," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I made you decaf." Clara took the mug of coffee he pushed across the laminate, wrapping both of her cold hands around the warm ceramic. She sank into the chair opposite him, too tired to brace herself for whatever wild theory he had been cooking up in the woods all week. "Silas, if this is about trying to trap that family of raccoons in the barn again, I really don't have the bandwidth tonight." "It's not the raccoons," Silas said. He rotated the yellow legal pad so it faced her. He tapped a grease-stained finger against the left side of a meticulously drawn T-chart. "This is the math on surrender. Harlan Royce offered to bush hog the orchard for free, but a rotary cutter can't handle trunks that thick. To actually do what the county extension agent told us to do, to hire a D7 bulldozer, rip out the root balls, push the slash into burn piles, and grade that slope will cost us exactly $3,200 in heavy machine time, plus another $800 in off-road diesel. Silas tapped the paper for emphasis. That's $4,000 out of pocket. And what do we get for it? We get bare dirt. We get to spend $4,000 just to have a blank hillside and a neighbor who doesn't think we're crazy. Clara took a slow sip of the decaf, letting the warmth coat her throat. Okay, and what's the other side of the paper? Silas slid his finger to the right column. Arthur Pritchard didn't plant garbage, Clara. He didn't plant a failed experiment. He planted a factory. I found his logs. These are Hughes crabs, Harrisons. They are highly specialized, high-tannin cider apples. The trees are perfectly alive. They just haven't had a maintenance cycle in a decade. The canopy is choked, the airflow is zero, and the vines are pulling them down. They just need to be structurally pruned, sprayed for dormant pests to break the insect cycles, and harvested. But to turn the factory back on, I need capital. Clara rubbed her eyes beneath her glasses. How much capital? Silas didn't flinch. He never flinched at numbers. Numbers were just the blueprints of reality. $7,850. Clara stopped rubbing her eyes and stared at him. That was more than half of what they had left in the world. I've got the equipment sourced, Silas continued, clicking open a tab on his laptop to show her a rusted piece of farm machinery. I need $1,400 for a used commercial drum chipper. If we don't chip the pruning slash, the wood rot will breed fungal diseases. I need $850 for a PTO-driven air blast sprayer. It's sitting in a defunct peach orchard down in Macon right now. The pump is seized, but I can rebuild it in an afternoon with $60 and new gaskets. He clicked to another tab, this one showing a gleaming, industrial-looking piece of equipment. And the big hit is $5,600. That's for a refurbished, Italian-made water bladder press and a stainless steel hammer mill. I found it on a commercial auction site up in New York. We can't use a hobby press for this volume. The hammer mill pulverizes the fruit. The bladder press uses our garden hose pressure to expand a balloon and squeeze the juice out. It's perfectly efficient. Clara looked at the spreadsheet, the neatly aligned columns of expenses and projections. She looked at the cracked red ledger, a ghost from 1978 dictating their financial future. Finally, she looked across the table at her husband. The exhaustion in her bones was heavy, but the life radiating from Silas was undeniable. He had spent the last 6 years coming home smelling of diesel exhaust, quietly ground down by fixing other men's broken machines. Now, he wanted to fix his own. She set her mug down on the table. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, save for the hum of the refrigerator. "You're absolutely sure about this?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but razor sharp. "You're sure they aren't just 14 acres of rotten apples?" Silas met her gaze, his expression dead serious. "They're not supposed to be eaten, Clara. They're supposed to be pressed. We have an absolute gold mine of bitterness sitting out there in the dark." Clara stared into her coffee for 3 long seconds. She let out a breath that sounded like a laugh giving way to a sigh. "Order the press," she said, pushing the yellow notepad back across the table. "But you're doing all the pruning." The sliding glass doors of the Tractor Supply in Athens hissed open, emitting a sharp blast of bitter January wind that cut right through the smell of cracked corn, vulcanized rubber, and synthetic fertilizer. It was a Tuesday morning. In farm country, the checkout line at the feed and hardware store is not merely a place of commerce. It is the town square, the gossip column, and the Supreme Court all rolled into one. Silas stood at register 2, unloading his cart. He heaved 4 heavy 5-gallon jugs of dormant horticultural oil onto the metal counter. It was thick, suffocating stuff, designed to be sprayed in the dead of winter to smother overwintering aphid eggs and scale insects before they could hatch. Next to the jugs, he placed a fiberglass-handled pole saw and 3 sets of Felco bypass pruners. The Felcos were the heavy, red-handled Swiss kind, the ones that cost $70 a pair and could cleanly sever a branch as thick as a man's thumb without crushing the wood. Behind him, a heavy yellow bucket of AW32 hydraulic fluid slammed down onto the belt. Silas didn't have to turn around to know the smell of diesel exhaust and damp pine shavings. It was Harlan Royce. Harlan was wearing a faded, insulated Carhartt vest over a flannel shirt, his large face ruddy from the January cold. Harlan didn't do quiet conversations. He possessed a voice designed to cut through the roar of industrial ventilation fans in a poultry house. "See, you're finally getting ready to fight the jungle, Silas," Harlan boomed. It was a deliberate volume. A teenager stalking heavy-duty work gloves an aisle over paused. The cashier, a young woman with a barcode scanner hanging from her wrist, stopped scanning the dormant oil. Two older men in John Deere caps looking at masonry drill bits at the end of the aisle turned their heads. Harlan had an audience, which was exactly what he wanted. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He just genuinely believed his neighbor was a naive fool, and in a place like Oglethorpe County, you corrected foolishness through public, performative ridicule. "You finally gonna cut those ugly sumbitches down?" Harlan asked, leaning heavily on his bucket of hydraulic fluid. "Because if that little fiberglass pole saw ain't enough, I got a steel chainsaw with a 20-inch bar you can borrow. Make short work of it." Silas didn't tense up. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket and began pulling out the cash he had carefully budgeted from his savings. "I'm not cutting them down, Harlan," Silas said, his voice flat, conversational, refusing to rise to the bait. "I'm just pruning them, going to harvest them in the fall." For a second, the Tractor Supply went completely silent, save for the tinny country music playing from the ceiling speakers. Then, Harlan Royce let out a booming, chest-deep laugh that echoed off the high, corrugated ceiling. "Harvest what? Vinegar?" Harlan wheezed, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. The two men looking at drill bits chuckled. "Son, I tasted one of Arthur Pritchard's apples back in '94. My jaw locked up for an hour. Tasted like battery acid and earwax. You can't sell those things to a starving pig, let alone a human person." The cashier looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment, holding out her hand for the money. "I'm not selling them to people," Silas said. He counted out $200 bills and a 50, handing them to the cashier. He took his receipt, folded it precisely in half, and slipped it into his pocket. "I'm pressing them." He picked up his pruners and grabbed two of the heavy jugs of oil by their plastic handles. Harlan shook his head, looking around at the other customers, as if to confirm that Silas had finally lost his mind. "Well, I hope you like drinking it yourself, son," Harlan called out loudly as Silas walked toward the automatic doors, "because ain't nobody in the state of Georgia gonna pay a single dime for Pritchard's poison." Silas didn't look back. The doors hissed open and he stepped out into the biting wind, the heavy weight of the oil pulling at his shoulders. Let them laugh. The trees were waiting. The 8 months that followed were less a foray into agriculture and more a sustained physical beating. When you tackle an orchard that hasn't seen a human hand in 3 decades, you aren't gardening. You are performing structural engineering with a chainsaw while balanced precariously on an aluminum ladder in a briar patch. Silas spent every weekend and every evening until the daylight bled out of the sky, vanishing into the canopy. He cut away dead wood thick as his own thigh to force sunlight and airflow back into the choked interior branches. He hauled and chipped literal tons of slash, the roar of the wood chipper echoing off the ridge. By August, he had burnt through 2 steel chainsaw bars and sweated off 15 pounds. His hands were permanently stained a mottled brown from tannin and bark. But the real disaster didn't happen out on the ladder. It happened on a cool evening in late September of 2012, during the first pressing. Silas had successfully harvested 3,000 pounds of Hughes, Crab, and Harrison apples. They sat stacked in the barn in heavy wooden macro bins, filling the space with a sharp, wildly astringent aroma. He wheeled the Italian bladder press and the stainless steel hammer mill into the center of the concrete pad, running an extension cord and a heavy rubber garden hose to the setup. This is exactly where his mechanical instincts betrayed him. In the world of heavy hydraulics and diesel engines, tighter tolerances equal higher efficiency. Silas looked at the milling screen, the metal grate that dictates how finely the fruit is chopped, and set it fine, 1/4 of an inch. He threw the switch and started feeding the bitter little apples into the hopper. The mill roared, but instead of spitting out a coarse, chunky pomace that would allow juice to weave and flow through the gaps, the machine churned out a dense, oxidized sludge. It had the exact consistency of heavy applesauce. Silas scooped the thick slurry into the mesh pressing bags, layered them inside the steel cage of the press, and turned the valve. Water from the hose began to fill the heavy rubber membrane in the center of the press. The gauge ticked upward. 10 psi, 20. At 30 psi, the laws of fluid dynamics took over. The water bladder expanded, pushing outward against the dense, unyielding wall of applesauce. Because the grind was too fine, the juice had no channels to escape. The pressure had nowhere to go. With a sound like a shotgun blast, the heavy industrial mesh bag ruptured. 400 pounds of sticky, heavily tannic apple sludge exploded outward in a violent 360-degree radius. It hit the barn walls with a wet, heavy slap. It plastered the rafters. It hit Silas dead in the chest, knocking him backward a step and completely coating his face, his hair, and his safety glasses in bitter brown grit. Silence fell over the barn, broken only by the steady hiss of the ruptured hose and the wet plop of apple mash dripping onto the concrete. Silas stood perfectly still, blinking through his fouled glasses. In a single second, he had just blown $1,800 worth of potential raw juice across the room. He spent the next 5 hours in the dark, dragging a hose around the barn, spraying down the walls and the floor. The chill autumn air bit at his soaked clothes. His hands, already raw from pruning, blistered under the freezing water. As he pushed the ruined slurry out the barn doors with a stiff push broom, the echo of Harlan Royce's mocking laughter seemed to bounce off the tin walls. It was a moment engineered to break a man's spirit, but Silas wasn't a farmer lamenting a lost crop. He was a mechanic diagnosing a failed system. At 2 a.m, soaking wet and smelling of sour fruit, Silas didn't go to the house to sleep. He walked into his garage workshop, fired up his angle grinder, and took a sheet of stainless steel. Sparks showered over his boots as he carefully machined a brand new 3/4-inch screen. He carried it back to the barn, swapped out the parts, tightened the bolts, and prepared to start again. When Silas engaged the bladder press with the newly machined 3/4-inch screen, the laws of fluid dynamics finally worked in his favor. There was no explosive buildup of pressure. The heavy rubber membrane expanded slowly against the coarse pomace, and from the spout at the bottom of the basin, a steady stream began to flow. It didn't look like apple juice. It poured out thick and dark, a deeply oxidized amber. It smelled deceptively sweet, carrying a rich aroma of damp autumn leaves and warm honey. But when Silas tasted a single drop, the astringency instantly stripped the moisture from his palate. He pumped the juice into bulk containers and pitched an aggressive strain of champagne yeast. It ate through the massive natural sugar content, converting it into alcohol and fermenting the liquid down to absolute, uncompromising dryness. When the bubbling stopped, Silas had yielded 250 gallons of raw, bone-dry cider. In February 2013, he transferred a fraction of the batch into 2 5-gallon stainless steel Cornelius kegs, packed them in ice in the bed of his Dodge Ram, and drove 3 hours north. He pulled into Blue Ridge Heritage Cider in Asheville, North Carolina. The transition from the sprawling poultry houses of Oglethorpe County was jarring. This was a high-end boutique operation that sold wax-dipped bottles to fine dining restaurants for $24 apiece. Silas hauled a keg into the loading bay and asked for Elias. Elias was the head cider maker, a man with an enology degree from Cornell. He wore a spotless, waterproof apron and moved around his immaculate facility with the precise grace of a lab technician. Silas set the keg down, attached a picnic tap, poured 2 ounces into a tasting glass, and handed it over without a word of a sales pitch. Elias swirled the amber liquid, sniffed it deeply, and took a sip. Silas watched the younger man's eyes widen. Elias didn't speak. He turned on his heel, walked briskly to a stainless steel workbench, and dropped a sample of the cider onto a digital pH meter. He quickly prepped a titration kit, dropping chemical reagents into a beaker. Your pH is 3.4, Elias said, staring at the digital readout as if it might be lying to him. And your malic acid is through the roof. The tannin structure is massive. He looked up, locking eyes with Silas. Where did you get Harrison and Taliaferro apples in Georgia? Silas wiped his hands on his jeans. I bought a farm that had a mistake on it. This isn't a mistake, Elias said softly. The clinical detachment was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, commercial hunger. This is liquid gold. How much volume can you produce this fall? Silas thought about the 14 acres of steep, tangled hillside that was finally open to the sun. If the weather holds, maybe 3,000 gallons? I will write a contract right now to buy 1,500 gallons of raw juice from you this October, Elias said. $8.50 a gallon. Silas didn't physically react, but his mind instantly locked onto the new arithmetic. He ran the numbers in his head. That was $12,750. For exactly half of a crop the county had told him to bulldoze into the dirt? Let me tell you about the night of April 14th, 2014. Because if you work in agriculture, you learn very quickly that paper contracts mean absolutely nothing when the atmosphere decides to turn against you. You can have a buyer in Asheville promising you the moon, but the sky doesn't care about ink on a page. That spring, the orchard had set a beautiful, impossibly heavy bloom. The 30-year-old trees were blanketed in fragile white and pale pink flowers. It looked like an absolute victory. But then the jet stream buckled. A freak late-spring polar vortex pushed down across the Appalachian spine and settled directly over the red clay of northeast Georgia. The local meteorologist on the radio sounded grim, predicting a hard freeze with a low of 26 degrees Fahrenheit between 3 and 6 in the morning. The botanical math of an apple orchard in bloom is brutal and unforgiving. At 28 degrees, you lose 10% of your blossoms. At 25 degrees, 90% of the cell walls rupture and the crop dies on the branch. Silas was looking at the total overnight annihilation of his entire projected $25,000 revenue before the fruit even had a chance to form. Silas didn't have $50,000 wind machines to mix the air. He didn't have miles of overhead micro-sprinklers to encase the buds in protective ice. What he had was a mechanic's intuitive, desperate understanding of thermodynamics and an absolute cellular refusal to lose this farm. At 1 in the morning, with the temperature already plunging to 31 degrees, Silas and Clara were in the cab of the Dodge Ram, hauling a heavy flatbed trailer down the pitch-black county road. They pulled into a neighboring cattle operation, waking the owner by pounding on his door to buy 30 round bales of ruined, rain-soaked fescue hay for $20 apiece. They drove back to the farm, the truck's tires slipping on the frost-slicked grass. Together, muscles burning and breath misting heavily in the frigid air, Silas and Clara dragged the massive, waterlogged bales off the deck, spacing them evenly across the steep 14 acres. By 2:30 in the morning, the mercury hit 29 degrees. The air was dead calm and sharp as glass. Silas grabbed a heavy-duty propane weed torch from the barn. He went from bale to bale, cracking the valve and holding the roaring blue flame against the rotting fescue. Because the hay was soaked through to its core, it refused to burn with a hot, consuming fire. Instead, it smoldered. It choked and sputtered, producing massive, billowing plumes of dense, gray-white smoke. This was the thermodynamics. The thick smoke rose up through the canopy, hit the cold air inversion layer hovering just above the trees, and flattened out. It created a synthetic, low-hanging cloud cover over the entire 14-acre bowl of the orchard. This artificial blanket effectively trapped the ambient radiant heat rising off the soil, preventing it from escaping into the freezing night sky. For the next 4 hours, Silas and Clara walked the rows in the dark, coughing in the suffocating smudge, their eyes watering profusely. They moved from tree to tree with flashlights, checking the small glass thermometers Silas had hung from the lower branches, praying the physics would hold. Out on the county highway, just past their property line, the temperature bottomed out at a killing 26 degrees. Inside the choking, acrid smoke blanket of Arthur Pritchard's orchard, the mercury never dropped below 29. When the sun finally crested the ridge, illuminating a hillside completely choked in artificial fog, Silas and Clara sat exhausted on the tailgate of the truck. Their faces were streaked with black soot and ash, their lungs burning. But they had saved 75% of their crop on a night when Oglethorpe County lost 80% of its commercial peaches. By October of 2016, Vance Heritage Orchards was no longer a weekend experiment. The LLC paperwork was framed above the kitchen table, and Silas's grease-stained John Deere mechanic uniforms were boxed up in the attic. He had quit the dealership. The barn now hummed not with the desperate, cobbled-together improvisation of a mechanic, but with the steady, sanitized efficiency of a commercial food facility. The old Italian bladder press was gone, replaced by a massive hydraulic rack and cloth press that could crush thousands of pounds of fruit in an hour. Silas wasn't just supplying Elias up in Asheville anymore. He was pumping raw, high-tannin juice for 5 different premium cider houses, stretching from the Carolinas down to the Florida Panhandle. It was late afternoon when a familiar, mud-splattered ATV rolled down Silas's driveway, followed closely by a heavy Ford F-250. Harlan Royce put his truck in park, but he didn't immediately get out. Harlan was having a brutal year. Farming is essentially a casino where the house controls the weather, and the house had been merciless that season. A relentlessly wet, humid summer had bred a devastating outbreak of pecan scab across the 30 acres of nut trees Harlan ran alongside his poultry houses. His yields were down 40%. To make the financial bleeding worse, the wholesale commodity price for pecans had cratered to a dismal $1.15 a pound. Harlan looked older than he had 5 years ago at the Tractor Supply. He looked like a man entirely exhausted by the margins. Harlan finally pushed his door open. He didn't walk over to greet his neighbor right away. He stood near his front bumper, staring at the concrete pad. Idling in front of Silas's barn was a gleaming 5,000-gallon stainless steel food-grade tanker truck with North Carolina plates. Its diesel engine purred with a deep industrial rhythm. Silas, wearing a heavy rubber washdown apron over his jeans, was wrestling a thick 2-inch sanitary hose, locking a stainless tri-clamp fitting onto the tanker's rear intake valve. Harlan took off his faded cap and ran a thick, calloused hand over his thinning hair. He walked over, his boots crunching heavily on the gravel. "Silas," he called out over the rumble of the idling truck. He pointed the brim of his cap at the massive silver cylinder. "What in the hell are you pumping into that thing?" Silas wiped his hands on a clean rag, checking the seal on the clamp to ensure there were no leaks. He looked up. "Juice, Harlan. Raw, unfermented cider juice." Harlan looked at the tanker. It was the size of a commercial milk hauler. The sheer volume of it broke against the agricultural realities Harlan had known his whole life. To fill a truck that size required a staggering amount of fruit. "What are they paying for a haul like that?" $11 a gallon, Silas said mildly, stepping back to open the massive butterfly valve on his holding tank. The math hit Harlan like a physical blow to the chest. He stared at the thick, translucent hose, watching the dark amber liquid pulse heavily through it. $11 a gallon. A 5,000-gallon truck. Harlan's mind spun the arithmetic of a $55,000 load, leaving a property the bank had once valued at $0. He slowly turned his head, looking past the barn, up toward the steep, south-facing slope. The 14 acres of ugly, overgrown trees were now immaculately pruned, their geometric rows clearly defined, their branches stretching open to the autumn sun, stripped of their harvest. "From Arthur Pritchard's Spitters?" Harlan asked, his voice losing every ounce of its usual booming, performative resonance. "From the Spitters, Harlan." Harlan Royce stood on the concrete pad for a long time. The metallic hum of the cider flowing into the tanker filled the heavy silence between them. He looked down at the scuffed toes of his work boots. All those years ago he had laughed. He had offered a bush hog to rip a man's livelihood out of the dirt for free. When he finally looked back up at Silas, the bluster of the county regular was entirely gone. "I was wrong," Harlan said quietly, the words catching slightly in the back of his throat. "I was dead wrong." He swallowed hard, turning his cap over and over in his hands. He looked up at the hillside again. You think you could show me how to graft some of them Harrisons onto a few acres I got cleared in the back?" By late February of 2018, the interior of Silas Vance's barn looked less like a traditional agricultural outbuilding and more like a high-end botanical fulfillment center. The massive hydraulic rack and cloth press sat dormant and meticulously sanitized under a tarp, waiting for autumn. Instead of the heavy, sweet and sour smell of oxidized fruit, the cold winter air inside the metal building was sharp with the scent of freshly cut green wood and damp peat moss. Silas stood at a long, stainless steel packing table, counting small, pencil-thick sticks of dormant wood and sliding them into insulated shipping sleeves. Beside him sat a stack of printed mailing labels destined for Portland, Ithaca, Grand Rapids, and Charlottesville. Let me tell you about the numbers in 2018, because out here in the Georgia Piedmont, philosophical victories do not pay the property taxes. If you want to survive the brutal realities of commercial agriculture, you need the math to work. Numbers are the only undeniable, objective truth in farming. Silas wasn't just pumping juice into tanker trucks anymore. It had taken him a few seasons, but his diagnostic mechanic's brain had finally recognized that the true monopoly of Arthur Pritchard's overgrown hillside wasn't strictly the fruit. It was the biological code itself. He possessed a motherlode of practically extinct heritage genetics. When Silas went out into the biting winter cold to structurally prune the canopy, he was no longer dragging the cuttings to a commercial chipper and blasting them into mulch. He was harvesting. He was snipping off the new vigorous terminal growth from the Hughes crabs, the Harrisons, and the Taliaferros. He was bundling them, keeping them dormant in refrigeration, and selling them to nurseries and aspiring cider makers across the continent who were absolutely desperate to replicate those old-world tannins. The ledger from that calendar year tells the complete story of a system repaired and running at peak efficiency. In the fall, Silas had pumped exactly 4,200 gallons of premium, unfermented cider juice into waiting stainless tankers. At a locked-in wholesale price of $12.50 a gallon, the liquid alone generated $52,500. But the winter pruning, the very act of maintaining the architecture of the trees, which used to cost him money, fuel, and exhaustion, now generated a second, highly lucrative income stream. He packaged and shipped 8,000 dormant sticks of scion wood at $4 a stick. That was an additional $32,000 of pure revenue mailed out in cardboard tubes. He had entirely outgrown Pritchard's original footprint. To keep up with the soaring regional demand, Silas had signed a long-term lease on an additional 20 acres of flat, sun-drenched pasture a mile down the county highway. Working alongside Clara, they had planted 3,000 new, custom-grafted trees to aggressively scale the operation, turning their own scion wood back into long-term equity. When they sat down at the kitchen table to run the year-end calculus, the arithmetic was absolute. Their total operating costs for the entire 12 months, factoring in off-road diesel, liability insurance, specialized yeast, bulk packaging, and the wages for the part-time local labor they had finally hired during the grueling harvest weeks, came out to exactly $24,100. Silas Vance netted $60,400 that year. He pulled a solidly middle-class income out of a piece of rugged, briar-choked dirt that a regional bank appraiser had confidently valued at exactly $0. And he achieved every single penny of it without ever once picking an apple, putting it in a plastic bag, and hoping someone would buy it off a grocery store shelf. If you find yourself driving down the Maxey's Highway today, winding through the rolling red clay expanse of Oglethorpe County, you'll know you've reached the place when the loblolly pines give way to a steep, south-facing slope that looks entirely unlike any other farm in the state. These aren't the neat, manicured rows of a commercial peach operation, nor the sterile rows of a modern, dwarfed apple orchard. The trees on this hillside are 48 years old now. They are ancient, gnarled giants, their trunks thick as whiskey barrels and textured with deep, furrowed bark. In the heavy, stagnant heat of late August, their branches sag toward the earth, propped up here and here by rough-hewn wooden crutches to keep the wood from snapping. They are bowed under the weight of thousands of bronze, russeted, bitterly perfect apples. It is a quiet, steady monument to a different way of seeing the world. Sometimes, the thing that everyone tells you is worthless, the thing they urge you to bulldoze, to bury, or to burn, isn't worthless at all. It is simply waiting for someone who has the patience to dig out the original manual and figure out how the machine was designed to run. Silas Vance didn't invent the cider apple, and he certainly didn't invent the act of fermentation. He was never a visionary. He was a mechanic. He simply refused to let a D7 bulldozer destroy a system he didn't yet understand. He looked at a harvest that made grown men gag, ignored the mocking laughter of the neighbors who measured their lives in bored feet of pine, and did the math. He understood that value isn't found in what is easy to consume, but in what is built to endure. And if you've got the right math, if you've accurately accounted for the acidity, the tannins, and the long-term potential of the soil, you don't ever need to ask anyone's permission to be right. You don't need a pat on the back from an extension agent or a nodding endorsement from the men at the feed store. You just need to press the fruit, capture the juice, and have the stubbornness to wait for the rest of the world to finally catch up to what you've known all along. The tanker trucks still come, the cider still flows, and the hillside, once appraised at 0, remains the most valuable asset for 100 miles in any direction. The bitterness, it turns out, was just the beginning.